The Hook. In 1803, the American West was not a map, it was a myth. Rumors spoke of woolly mammoths still roaming the plains, mountains made of solid salt, and a northwest passage that would link the Atlantic to the Orient. President Thomas Jefferson sent two men into a wilderness where no white man had ever set foot, with a simple yet terrifying instruction: find a way through or do not come back. This is the true story of 33 people and one dog who walked into the jaws of a continent to find the soul of a nation. Chapter 1: The President's Fever Dream. The flickering candlelight in the East Room of the White House cast long, dancing shadows across a map that was mostly blank. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, stared at the vast expanse west of the Mississippi River. To the Europeans, it was terra incognita, unknown land. To Jefferson, it was the future of the American empire. The Louisiana Purchase had just doubled the size of the young country for a mere $15 million. But there was a problem. The United States had bought a land it didn't understand. Jefferson needed a leader, someone with the iron will of a soldier and the observant eye of a scientist. He found that man in his own personal secretary, Captain Meriwether Lewis. Lewis was a man of undoubted courage, but he was also prone to melancholy, a brooding darkness that shadowed his brilliant mind. To balance him, Lewis chose his old army friend, William Clark. Clark was a steady hand, a master cartographer, and a man who could lead men through the gates of hell without losing his temper. They called their group the Corps of Discovery. Chapter 2: The Brown Water of the Missouri. On May 14, 1804, under a heavy gray sky, the expedition pushed off from Camp Wood near St. Louis. Their vessel was a 55-foot keelboat loaded with 7 tons of supplies: flour, salt pork, whiskey, scientific instruments, and Indian presents like mirrors, beads, and lace. The Missouri River was a beast. The men called it the Big Muddy. It was a labyrinth of falling banks, hidden sandbars, and sawyers, giant submerged trees that could impale a boat in seconds. The men didn't just sail, they rowed, they poled, and when the current was too strong, they jumped into the chest-deep mud and pulled the massive boat with ropes like beasts of burden. As they moved deeper into what is now Missouri and Kansas, the landscape began to change. The dense forests gave way to the Great Plains, a sea of grass that stretched to the horizon. They saw animals that defied description: barking squirrels, prairie dogs, herds of buffalo so large they blackened the earth for miles, and the terrifying grizzly bear, a creature the natives warned them about, but the Americans underestimated until the first time they tried to kill one. Chapter 3: The Sergeant's Sacrifice. Death visited them early, but not in the way they expected. In August 1804, Sergeant Charles Floyd fell gripped by a searing pain in his abdomen. Today, we know it was a ruptured appendix, a death sentence in the 19th century. On a wind-swept bluff overlooking the river, Floyd whispered his last words: "I am going to leave you. I want you to write me a letter." He was the only member of the expedition to die during the entire 2-year journey. The men buried him with full military honors, marking the spot with the cedar post. It was a sobering reminder: the wilderness was indifferent to their mission. Chapter 4: The Winter at Fort Mandan and the Arrival of a Legend. By the time the autumn frost turned the prairies gold, the Corps reached the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa nations in what is now North Dakota. The temperature plummeted to -40 degrees. Breath froze on eyelashes. Skin tore when touched to cold metal. They built a log fortress, Fort Mandan, to survive the winter. It was here that history took a turn. They met a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau and his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. Sacagawea was only about 16 years old and pregnant. She had been kidnapped from her people years before. Lewis and Clark realized they were their most valuable asset. Not only could she translate, but the presence of a woman and a baby was a universal white flag. A war party never traveled with a mother. Sacagawea wasn't just a guide, she was the expedition's shield. In the dead of winter, inside a cramped hut, Sacagawea gave birth to a son, Jean-Baptiste. Clark nicknamed him Pomp. 6 weeks later, with a newborn strapped to her back, this teenage mother stepped into a pirogue to help lead 30 men across a continent. Chapter 5: The Gates of the Rocky Mountains. As the spring thaws arrived in 1805, the expedition sent the keelboat back to Jefferson with crates of specimens, a live prairie dog, magpies, and detailed maps. The main party pushed west in smaller canoes. They were looking for the Great Falls of the Missouri, which the Indians said would be a sign they were near the mountains. When they finally heard the roar, it wasn't one fall, it was 5. It took the exhausted men a month to carry their heavy canoes 18 miles around the falls, hacking a path through prickly pear cactus that pierced their moccasins. Then they saw them. On the horizon, the shining mountains, the Rockies. Jefferson believed the Rockies would be a single, easy ridge like the Appalachians. Instead, Lewis and Clark found a wall of jagged, snow-capped rock that seemed to touch the stars. They were out of water, they were out of easy paths. They needed horses, or they would die in the snow. Chapter 6: The Reunion of Blood. In a stroke of luck that feels like fiction, the first group of Shoshone Indians they encountered was led by Chief Kameawait. As Sacagawea began to translate, she suddenly broke into tears. She realized the chief was her lost brother. The reunion saved the expedition. The Shoshone provided the horses, and the warnings, the path ahead through the Bitterroot Mountains was a trail of starvation. What followed was the most brutal leg of the journey. They climbed through mountain passes where the air was thin and the snow was hip-deep. They ran out of food. To survive, they were forced to kill and eat some of their own pack horses. They were reduced to eating portable soup, a disgusting gelatinous glue Jefferson had provided. They were skeletal, freezing, and lost. Chapter 7: The Salmon People and the Roar of the Great Water. The core of Discovery emerged from the Bitterroot Mountains, not as conquerors, but as ghosts. They were emaciated, their clothes were tattered rags, and their feet were bleeding through worn-out moccasins. As they stumbled into the White Prairie in late September 1805, they encountered the Nez Perce, or the Nimipu. To the Nez Perce, these white men looked like walking corpses. There was a moment, a terrifying, silent heartbeat in history, where the Nez Perce warriors considered killing the explorers to take their high-quality rifles and remaining trade goods. However, an elderly woman named Watkuwais, who had once been a captive of white traders in the East and treated with kindness, pleaded for their lives. "Do them no hurt," she whispered. Because of her, the Nez Perce didn't just spare the Americans, they fed them. The Great Sickness of Plenty. After weeks of starvation, the men gorged themselves on dried salmon and camas roots provided by the Nez Perce. It was a disaster. Their digestive systems, weakened by portable soup and horse meat, revolted. For days, the entire expedition lay incapacitated with violent stomach cramps. Lewis was so sick he could barely stand, leaving Clark to negotiate for the building of new canoes. But the mission couldn't wait. Winter was coming, and the scent of salt was theoretically in the air. Under the guidance of Chief Twisted Hair, the men burned out the centers of massive cedar trees to create 5 new dugout canoes. They left their horses with the Nez Perce, a gamble of pure trust, and pushed off into the Clearwater River. Riding the Dragon's Back. For the first time since leaving St. Louis, the current was finally with them. They were flying downstream. But the Clearwater led to the Snake River, and the Snake led to the Columbia, the great river of the West. The Columbia was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was a massive, surging artery of water carved through basalt canyons. At places like the Dalles and the Short Narrows, the entire weight of the river was squeezed into a gap only 45 yards wide. The water boiled and swirled in terrifying great chutes. Local tribes gathered on the cliffs to watch the crazy white men attempt to navigate rapids that even a locals bypassed. With Clark at the helm and the men rowing for their lives, the canoes shot through the white water like arrows. They survived, much to the amazement of the watching Chinooks. Ocean in view. Oh, the joy! On November 7, 1805, the fog lifted, and William Clark scribbled one of the most famous and most misspelled entries in American history. Ocean in view. Oh, the joy! He could hear the distant roar of the surf. He could see the expanse of gray water. The men cheered, thinking their journey was over. But the great unknown had one last cruel joke to play. They weren't at the ocean yet. They were in the massive estuary of the Columbia, and a ferocious winter storm was about to pin them against the jagged rocks. For 3 weeks they were trapped in a dismal niche of the coast. The rain was relentless, a cold Pacific Northwest soak that rotted their clothes off their backs. Giant waves tossed massive 100-foot-long driftwood logs at their camp like matchsticks. They were soaked, starving again, and literally falling apart. The vote, a moment of true democracy. On November 24th, with the weather worsening, Lewis and Clark did something unprecedented in the history of the United States military. They held a vote to decide where to build their winter quarters. York, Clark's enslaved servant, was allowed to vote. Sacagawea, a woman and a Native American, was allowed to vote. In a time when neither black people nor women had any legal rights in America, the necessities of the wilderness forced a radical equality. They voted to cross to the south side of the river, where they built Fort Clatsop. There, amidst the constant rain and the smell of rotting elk meat, the Corps of Discovery prepared for the long wait. They had reached the edge of the world. Now they just had to figure out how to get home. Chapter 8. The Rainy Purgatory of Fort Clatsop. If the crossing of the Rockies was a test of bone and sinew, the winter of 1805 to 1806 at Fort Clatsop was a test of the human spirit. The Corps had reached the Pacific, yes, but the great water was not the paradise they had envisioned. It was a gray, churning monster that brought with it a relentless, bone-chilling rain that did not stop for 106 out of the 122 days they stayed there. The Moccasin Factory. The expedition was literally rotting. Their blue wool uniforms had long ago disintegrated into tattered fringes. Their leather breeches were perpetually wet, smelling of smoke and rancid grease. To occupy the men and prepare for the 4,000-mile walk home, Lewis and Clark turned the fort into a factory. They spent their days dressing elk skins and sewing. By the time they pulled stakes in the spring, the men had manufactured 338 pairs of moccasins. They knew the jagged rocks of the Bitterroots were waiting for them, and a man without leather on his feet was a dead man. The elk meat monopoly. Food was a monotonous nightmare. The men lived almost exclusively on lean elk meat. While that sounds like a paleo diet dream to a modern American, it was a culinary prison for the Corps. They consumed roughly 131 elk over the winter. Because the meat was so lean, they suffered from protein poisoning, a state where you are full but starving because of a lack of fat. To supplement their diet, Clark sent a small detail down to what is now Seaside, Oregon, to establish a salt-making camp. For weeks, 3 men stayed by the crashing surf, boiling 5 giant kettles of seawater 24 hours a day. They eventually scratched out 28 gallons of salt.
Lewis called it an excellent, fine, strong, and white luxury, the only thing that made the rotting elk meat palatable. Shrewd neighbors and cultural clashes. The local Clatsop and Chinook Indians were not like the horse lords of the plains. They were wealthy, sophisticated traders who had dealt with maritime fur ships for years. They knew the value of a blue bead and a copper kettle, and they drove a hard bargain. Lewis, whose melancholy began to deepen in the damp darkness of the fort, grew frustrated with the coastal tribes. He found them loquacious and shrewd. In contrast, Clark remained the diplomat, charting the shoreline and sketching the massive California condor and the ulachon, or candlefish, a fish so oily the natives literally stuck a wick in it and burned it like a candle. The departure, a race against the calendar. By March 1806, the Corps was desperate. Their trade goods, their currency they needed to buy passage and food from tribes, were down to almost nothing. They were reduced to 2 kegs of powder and a handful of needles and beads. On March 23, 1806, without waiting for the spring weather to truly break, the Corps of Discovery abandoned Fort Clatsop. They left their names on the wall, a message in a bottle for any ship that might arrive, and paddled their canoes back into the teeth of the Columbia River. They were heading east. They were heading home. But between them and St. Louis lay a wall of snow that had not yet begun to melt, and a Blackfeet nation that did not yet know they were coming.
Chapter 9. The Divided Path and the Final Sprint. The journey home was not a simple backtracking of their footsteps. Meriwether Lewis, driven by a restless scientific hunger and the pressure to deliver a perfect map to Jefferson, made a daring, some would say reckless, decision. At a place called Traveler's Rest in present-day Montana, he split the Corps in 2. Clark would lead a party to explore the Yellowstone River, while Lewis would head north to explore the Marias River, hoping to find a northern boundary for the Louisiana Purchase. They were dividing their strength in the heart of hostile territory. The fight on the Marias. On July 26, 1806, Lewis's small group encountered 8 young Blackfeet warriors. The night began with a tense peace. They shared buffalo meat and slept near the same fire. But at dawn, the Blackfeet attempted to seize the expedition's rifles. A chaotic, bloody scuffle broke out. One Blackfeet warrior was stabbed to death. Another was shot through the chest by Lewis himself. It was the only time during the entire 2-year journey that the Corps killed Native Americans. Realizing that a larger war party would soon be on their heels, Lewis and his men rode their horses for 120 miles in 24 hours, a desperate gallop across the plains to reach the safety of the Missouri River. The most ridiculous injury in history. Just as the parties reunited, tragedy nearly struck from within. While out hunting, Pierre Cruzat, a one-eyed, nearsighted fiddler, spotted something brown moving in the brush. Thinking it was an elk, he fired. It wasn't an elk. It was Meriwether Lewis. The bullet passed through Lewis's left buttock, narrowly missing his hip bone. For the next several weeks, the great explorer had to lie face down in a canoe, cursing his luck and the aim of his blindest hunter. It was a humiliating injury for a man who had survived grizzlies and the Rockies, but in true Corps fashion, they kept moving. The Return of the Ghosts. On September 23, 1806, the residents of St. Louis looked toward the river and saw 3 tattered, sun-blackened boats. The men inside were bearded, dressed in elk skins, and rowing with a rhythmic power that spoke of thousands of miles. The town went wild. Most Americans had assumed the Corps of Discovery was dead, eaten by mammoths or lost in the Pacific. As the men stepped onto the docks, they weren't just soldiers. They were the first Americans to have seen the shining mountains and the great water. They had traveled 8,000 miles and brought back a map that would change the world forever. The end. The cost of discovery. The story of Lewis and Clark has the ultimate American ending. It is one of immense triumph and deep, lingering shadows. The reward: every man in the Corps received double pay and 320 acres of land. York, the enslaved man who had been vital to the survival of the group, asked Clark for his freedom as a reward. Clark refused for years, a dark stain on an otherwise heroic legacy. The failure. Lewis had to tell Jefferson the bad news. There was no Northwest Passage. There was no easy water route to the Pacific. The American dream of an easy trade route was dead, but in its place was a vast, wealthy continent ready for a new nation to fill it. The final mystery. Meriwether Lewis never recovered from the journey. The melancholy that Jefferson feared took hold of him. In 1809, while traveling to Washington, D.C., he died of gunshot wounds at a lonely inn on the Natchez Trace. To this day, historians debate whether it was a suicide or a murder. He was only 35. The legacy. The Corps of Discovery did more than just map rivers. They described 122 animals and 178 plants previously unknown to science. They proved that the American West was not a wasteland, but a garden. As the sun sets on their story, we remember them not just as explorers, but as the 33 souls who looked at the edge of the world and decided to keep walking. They turned a blank space on a map into a home for millions.